Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Sarah Brown. I'm a senior editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I'm here with my pal Rick Seltzer, senior writer at the Chronicle. How's it going, Rick?
I'm hanging in there. I'm really looking forward to talking about pitchers and catchers reporting and spring training this baseball season.
I myself am gearing up for my fantasy baseball draft. I'm sure a bunch of other people here in the chat are as well. If you have any advice for me, let me know. Welcome, welcome all ideas, especially on first baseman. Really in the look out for that. Um, we're really glad to have you joining us today. Rick is the author of our daily briefing. This is our subscriber only newsletter that makes sense of the day's higher ed news in a digestible format. Many of you all might be subscribers, many of you may not be, but this is the place where, Rick has been making sense of the past month of the Trump administration just every single day. And from my vantage point, I'm the Chronicle's news editor. So I have been leading the coverage decisions and the articles that you see appearing on our website. So we do not have all the answers, far from it, but we have been doing a lot of reporting, and we thought it would be valuable to offer some initial insights and analysis about what we've been seeing so far from the Trump administration and kind of what's next. So just before we get started, I'm going to do a little poll. We know that the Trump administration has already impacted campuses, and we'd really like to get a sense of exactly what kinds of effects you're already feeling. Are you getting messages from your campus president or administration? Have you formed a task force? Have you frozen hiring? Have you stopped programs? We would love to hear a little bit more about kind of what you're already seeing and experiencing, and that will help inform the conversation as we go along. A couple of housekeeping notes. The Q&A is open. We do really encourage you to weigh in, ask us some questions, engage with your fellow attendees. There are a lot of you here. We're not going to be able to get to everybody's questions, but rest assured that we do read every single question that you all send in. It informs our coverage going forward, and so we really want you to engage with us, so please do that. The chat is going to be used for sharing resources. And if for whatever reason, you weren't able to attend live, etc., we will be sending an email link with those resources, as well as a link to the full recording after we're done here today. One other just housekeeping note, please be civil. Just goes without saying. I wish I didn't have to say it, but we are all trying to create a productive space to talk about what the Trump administration has meant for higher ed policy so far. And I just really encourage you to sort of embrace that in your engagement today. Again, we're not going to get to everything, but if you want to keep up every single day with what is happening in the Trump administration, you should subscribe to the daily briefing. This is your one-stop shop for, what is happening, what happened yesterday, what does it mean for me, what does it mean for my job. That's what Rick is doing every single day. So I'd really encourage you, if you are not already an individual subscriber to the Chronicle, to consider doing that. So I'm going to close the poll now, and we'll see what kinds of responses we got so far. So we're seeing a lot of, send messages to the campus, formed a task force. We are also seeing quite a lot of hiring freezes, stopped or changed DEI efforts. We're definitely going to talk about DEI today. What's clear in these results is that the campuses are already feeling Trump. This is already having a real impact on campuses, and we're going to talk about that today. So Rick, I'm not going to lie, I was naive. I did not think that the Trump administration was going to go after higher education on day one. I knew that Project 2025 existed. And, the Chronicle Review actually published a really fantastic essay in March of 2024 articulating what's in Project 2025 and basically saying, hello, higher ed. Trump very well might get reelected. He and his allies have published this blueprint about how they're going to overhaul higher ed, and you should pay attention to it. And, the essay written by Stephen Brent, really, really thoughtful political science professor, he basically said, higher ed needs to wake up. You're sleepwalking into the election. I don't feel like I was sleepwalking into the election, but I was naive. So uh, can you tell us right off, like, why is higher ed under attack right now? Like, why did Trump go after higher ed right away? What's going on?
I think there are several different reasons for that. Like many things, there's no simple answer. I mean, first and foremost, it was an effective message that they ran on, and it resonated with a certain corner of their base. And um, the Trump administration has made no qualms about trying to deliver on things it promised its base. Um, Maybe one of the reasons this resonated so much with the base is that a lot of the ideas they're pursuing are not new in conservative politics. Anyone who's followed Republican politics, sometimes kind of outside of Republican politics, have seen long articulated goals like close the education department, certain cuts to federal funding, even research funding. There have been voices arguing for some of those things and some of the other things that we're going to talk about today. So that was all preloaded, if you will. Um, there's kind of a secondary question embedded in your question, which is, okay, so if this all existed on the right, why are we seeing it now? I think there are a couple of reasons. One is we're seeing very emboldened actors. Um, Whatever you think about President Trump, he does not have the same sense of constraints that other presidents have had in pursuing some of these goals. He has advisors or employees like Elon Musk on his side who give him both financial heft to keep members of the legislature in line, but also this move fast and break things mentality that you saw him take to Twitter is now playing off in the government. So you just have folks who are empowered to change the system and change it fast before any opposition can bog things down. And I think that speed is really part of the strategy that you've seen the GOP or folks aligned with the GOP talk about for a long time. Some of you who read the New York Times probably saw they surfaced a quote from Steve Bannon, the Trump advisor, about starting out at muzzle velocity. It's kind of a similar theory to the flood the zone. You overwhelm the system, no one can focus on what you're doing, and you can make changes before anyone can catch up. And frankly, education is a space where it is hard to make lasting changes. There's been a lot of back and forth over the last decade plus, and some parts of the system felt very much like they had to give. So you combine all of those things, and I think you have a recipe for what we've seen in the last month, even if it feels like it's been a lot longer than the last month.
It really does. And another thing that I've been thinking about too is the precedent that was set even while Biden was still president. The House of Representatives, controlled by Republicans, dragged several presidents of elite colleges before Congress and basically named and shamed them. And by and large, those presidents did not perform well in the public eye. And yes, those were a particular group of presidents representing an exceedingly narrow slice of our world, but it feels like it set the tone for what was coming.
I think that's right, and I think there are other precedents that we can talk about too, depending on how deep into the weeds you want to get. We probably won't go too far into them. I am not a lawyer. This is my full disclosure I have to give everyone. A lot of the things we're talking about are thorny legal questions. But things like this recent Dear Colleague letter that tried to force institutions or threaten institutions to stamp out DEI on campus actually builds on some things that the Biden administration or even the Obama administration did from a legal perspective. It extends it certainly, but you had this argument on the right that let's take the tools that Democrats have developed and use them to our own ends. And then you had this other precedent you talked about, which is college leaders and maybe the idea of protest being discredited or cowed by congressional investigations. Certainly, there were some cases where there were disturbing things happening on campus, but there was also a political strategy going on there where leaders were on their heels. And I do think we're looking at a question of opposition campus protest movements being able to stand up for campus needs. There's kind of a question, we're still in the aftermath of this very wrenching anti-war or pro-Palestinian protest movement. And I think that is kind of a hanging over campuses' reactions. How much can they stand up for their own interests now after they're really trying to rebuild some sense of control, some sense of having it together before the public eye.
And we're going to get into that in a sec. I actually wanted to start first by just asking for you, what was the first sign of how the Trump administration was going to approach higher ed policy? Like, what was the first sign? Oh, this is how they're going to do it.
I actually think back to long before we knew for sure that it was going to be a Trump administration. May 2023, I think it was. I very distinctly remember writing a very small piece in the Daily Briefing about a campaign video in which then candidate Trump talked about going after and firing radical accreditors. Um, at the time, you could make the argument, oh, this is just red meat for the base. I thought it was interesting because I don't get the sense that you talk about that kind of a pressure point in the higher ed system. Accreditation is exceedingly complicated, but it is also important for one simple reason. It is the gatekeeper that allows institutions to access federal financial aid. You don't have accreditation, you can't get paid for Pell Grants, you can't get paid in federal student loan money. And I don't think you talk about a pressure point like that unless someone on your team has put a lot of thought into how you motivate change within the sector. The other key point that's a little closer after we had the election, but before the inauguration, was when Linda McMahon was nominated to be the Secretary of Education. Again, there was an initial knee jerk. I had the initial knee jerk to kind of dismiss this, saying, well, Linda McMahon, she's a longtime Trump backer. They were just looking for a cabinet appointment for her. But the more you look at it, the more there's an alignment there. Lynn McMahon also chaired America First Policy Institute, this Trump-aligned think tank that has done a lot of the intellectual work and the work of laying plans for what they were going to do. And she talked a lot about education on those things. And I think that alignment was another signal that while education and higher education is far from the only change that they are seeking, it was going to be a big part of the early package.
Yeah, and even once Trump actually was officially in office, he gave off these signals again sort of right away. I mean, in his inaugural address, I remember him talking about we need to return to meritocracy. And this is kind of an age-old debate, frankly, in higher education. But the way that Trump was talking about it, he was kind of, it felt like he was going after sort of all the principles and ideals that higher ed has really that have really built higher ed, at least in the last 25 years or so. Diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, LGBTQ rights, protections based on gender identity. One thing that really did strike me when he, in the executive orders that he signed, he even went after Hispanic serving institutions and tribal colleges, not historically Black colleges, but he did go after other minority serving institutions. And that really struck me. What did you think about that?
Yeah, I think one of the key insights of the Trump circle is that identifying some sort of a threat to a deeply held belief or a national identity or a group identity can kind of knit together different constituencies. And the right actually has a lot of different constituencies it's trying to hold together right now. And higher ed's a place that has sometimes willingly grappled with and sometimes been forced to grapple with the fact that it is an American institution that serves people from different racial, ethnic, gender backgrounds. And that makes it a very important institution to push, to change, to shape in the image of the society you want if you are seeking to make major changes. And I think that's the alignment there.
So we can't go any farther without talking about the funding freeze. It felt kind of like the first big shoe to drop. I remember the day that the funding freeze happened and was sort of having its ripple effects across higher ed. I had a college president who was visiting us in DC, and we often have presidents visit us. If you were ever in DC, we really encourage you to come by and chat with us. We want to hear from you. But I had a college president come by, and the meeting was at like 2 p.m. And only an hour before this meeting had we finally gotten information from the education department that the funding freeze did not apply to Title IV financial aid. I mean, there were several hours where this president was straight up panicking. Like 70% of my students are on financial aid. And this was, to be clear, a president who supported President Trump. So, I mean, that was such a vivid memory for me. I'm curious, as you were, like, what did you learn when you were reporting on the funding freeze, making sense of it? Like, what did that moment tell you about where
I
we're going?
Yeah, I think the funding freeze is one of three big policy planks that we should talk about, and it's definitely the most important one because it's the first, and it is the one that kind of instructed the way that everything would follow. Um, it was dropped, I believe, the memo that implemented it came out on Monday night. Uh, Tuesday morning, we did not have a ton of detail, and I actually think the way the detail trickled out is really instructive. Um, so first, what did it do? The budget office directed a freeze of much of the funding that gets dispersed, so it could be reviewed for, I think the term was something like consistency with the president's policies. Um, and the morning after it went out, the education department, I think it was around 10:30 a.m., but it may have been a little later, a little earlier on the East Coast, finally puts out something that says, okay, Pell Grants and student loans are not affected. Great. We all had some questions about that. I sent some questions in, other reporters sent some questions in. By early afternoon, they were clarifying that only discretionary grants would be frozen. So that's exempting Title I funding, funding for students with disabilities, other formula grants would keep going. And I'm trying very hard not to get into jargon here, but it's hard to talk about this without talking about accounting principles. So if you start falling asleep, just yell at me. But it took then a little while longer, and they got back to me and said, no, minority serving institutions aren't going to lose funding. So that's HBCUs and others that receive Title III and Title V funding, other pots of money. At the time, my sense was they were telling me that minority serving institutions HSI funding was safe. I certainly think folks have raised questions about that since then. But it was just this steady drip of what's happening, them getting a partial answer, and then that answer just raising more questions. And I think that shows that even the folks in the agencies either didn't know it was coming or didn't know exactly how it was going to be implemented. And I think that has added to this sense of uncertainty and chaos. And again, that may be part of that muzzle velocity, that chaos by design that we talked about earlier. It may just be that some of the folks weren't on the same page. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but it was instructive because some of the other things that they've put out have followed this similar path, including by the end of, I believe it was by the end of that Tuesday, but certainly by the end of that week, the freeze was blocked. A court challenge, several court challenges mounted. A judge enjoined it while those court challenges proceeded. And since then, we've actually seen a lot of fighting over whether the Trump administration is releasing the funding that it is supposed to be releasing. They're using all sorts of accounting techniques to say, well, we're allowed to withhold this funding. And in some cases, they probably are. Some cases, they may not be. But it's this whole arc of big directive, let the agencies kind of figure it out or message it, let everyone try to scramble and catch up. And then the court system slowly catches up and does its thing, is an arc that we've seen several times.
And then there's the question of, is the court system even like doing what it is supposed to be doing in this, or is it having the desired effect? Because I mean, we not only did our own reporting and heard this from people, we also saw really great reporting in other publications, basically making clear that the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health did not fully unfreeze funding. I mean, there's no question that there are questions about the extent to which they unfroze it for some things and not others, but they definitely were not fully, the federal funding was not fully flowing in the days and even for the couple of weeks after the court order blocking it was put in place, which is, it's a whole other issue that gets into sort of existential questions about the constitutional crisis we might find ourselves in. But that is a topic for another day.
Well, but beyond those legal questions, I mean, it matters on campus, right? If you have a grant and you need money from that grant to run your program or pay your people, this is why you see so many people not just kind of sitting back and discussing this from a legal perspective, but saying this is a growing problem for how we actually run the institutions.
So let's talk about immigration. I really thought that Trump's first few weeks in office were going to be all about immigration, and to some extent, they have been, right? And for a lot of communities, those policies have absolutely had real impact right away. And to be clear, things did happen right away that had implications for higher ed. The sensitive locations policy was rescinded pretty much immediately. This had been in place for the better part of a decade, and it basically said ICE does not do sort of proactive immigration enforcement on college campuses and in schools. The same week as the funding freeze, Trump signed an executive order on combating campus anti-Semitism and said that one of the key ways that he planned to enforce this order was to deport international students who had participated in pro-Palestinian anti-war protests. I'm curious, from what you've sort of seen so far as you've been reading, reporting, analyzing, how much is Trump's immigration agenda actually touching campuses? I feel like people are really freaked out, and that's completely understandable. I'm curious, like, if we can make it a little more concrete. Like, what have you seen so far?
Yeah, well, certainly tensions run high. People are on edge. I think one reason tensions are on edge is because the message is so powerful, but the details are still hazy. If I'm remembering the executive order correctly, it's deport international students if they broke the law. Well, that phrase, if they broke the law, is doing a lot of work there. Do they have to be convicted? At what point in the process do you put them in a different justice system, right? I mean, there's all sorts of questions that you could ask that, depending how much credit you want to give the legal system, may or may not respect rights.
Well, and also just to clarify that, like, there was there were different things in the order and in the guidance from the White House that
Right.
was sort of a fact sheet on the order. In the fact sheet, Trump made pretty clear that he wanted to deport international students who had just participated point blank, even though the executive order talked about unlawful actions.
You're absolutely right. That's the broader message. That's the broader intent that they are signaling. And that's why you see such concern on campus, is because you see that dynamic play over and over again. Is there's one piece of specific language and then there's other broader language. Now, as far as what actual concrete action we've seen on campuses, I've seen one credibly reported instance of ICE arresting a former student on a campus. I believe it was at Spokane Community College in Washington State. It was in a parking lot. I believe it was late at night. That is the only one that I have seen. That does not mean it has not happened elsewhere. Does not mean that it has not happened. It has not been reported in other cases. But we know it has happened at least once, which means it can happen again. In that case, I believe that campus police or campus law enforcement were given a heads up briefly before. I do not believe that they participated in the arrest at all. We have, separate from actual reported arrests, we have seen some cases of what I call student intimidating students. In some cases, it's not clear whether it was intentional. In some cases, it's very clear what they were doing. So there was one report about a group of students who was dressed as ICE officers that tried to enter a dormitory. They were turned away. They were later arrested. It is not legal to pretend to be a federal law enforcement officer, it turns out. And there was another report of a student group. I believe it was a explicitly right-leaning student group holding an event, public event, where they were calling for deportations of other students on campus. So you're seeing this trickle-down effect in behavior on campus, as well as this question of when law enforcement shows up, whether they show up. Let me circle right around real quickly to the law enforcement question. Most campus guidance that I've seen, and campus has been pretty clear about putting out this guidance, is that if an immigration officer shows up, they should be routed to a central point of contact. Students do have some legal rights to privacy. Certain areas of campus are more restricted than others. And institutions are trying to make very clear to their employees, you should not be blocking them, because legally you probably cannot do that, or you definitely cannot do that. But we want to do this in a manner where we're sure that we're complying with the law, is the argument there. So that's the guidance I've seen again and again. And I think that's a pretty important set of points that they're hitting. Many of the listeners here probably saw that guidance on their own, but I think it's important to highlight right now.
Another thing a lot of listeners here have been thinking about, talking about, freaking out about, understandably, is research funding. This was another sort of late on a Friday night announcement from the Trump administration. Just to be clear, that is not just a Trump administration thing. Presidents of both political parties love to drop major education news. It feels like late on a Friday night.
And journalists love it. It's not all about us, but we just love it when something comes out on Friday night. And we thought we had a weekend, and now we don't.
Exactly. So this announcement comes out, says we are immediately capping indirect costs for all research grants at 15%. It sent higher ed reeling. Big research institutions were talking about literally losing $100 billion overnight. And frankly, even though the amounts were smaller in terms of like funding loss for like some of the smaller R1s and R2 institutions, I mean, this was existential for them. Like $5 million loss overnight is they don't have that. They don't have that cash in the bank. This is also not the first time that this issue has entered the chat. Trump actually tried to take on indirect costs in his first administration. And frankly, it didn't go anywhere. This has not been a political winner. Even Republican lawmakers who want to cut costs do not want to harm the flagship university in their state. That is not popular. Um, why do you think that Trump went after research funding so aggressively? And do you think that they'll keep this fight up, or might they be like, yeah, maybe we went a little too far on that one. We're going to cut back?
I do think this is going to be a fight that continues. I have no necessarily inside information here, but the most prestigious and powerful institutions in the country are on one side, and the Trump administration is on the other, and they love nothing more than to be seen as fighting this set of exclusive institutions. Um, I think to your point about this being a priority in the first Trump administration or an effort in the first Trump administration, the potential for conflict has been here for a long time. It actually predates the Trump administration. If I'm remembering right, the Obama administration looked at capping some overhead on research funding. And when you really dig into what's going on, you can see why folks who either want to save money or are skeptical of spending might look at this and say, what's going on here? And you can see why colleges will look at it and say, we need this money. This is money that is charged in addition to the grant money that's supposed to go for the research itself. And it's supposed to go to all of the things to support all the things you need to be able to do research: facilities, laboratories, administrative overhead. You know, somebody has to submit the receipts, et cetera, et cetera. The NIH funding rates are negotiated on an institution by institution basis. The average rate, I think that the administration said, was something like 28%. Some of the really big places negotiated 50%, 60, almost 70%. When you look at those numbers and you put them out that way, whether or not they're defensible in the court of public opinion, it's hard to defend those numbers. It's not impossible, but it's hard. And so the administration has a home turf to start from there. The other part is they really are looking for savings. They want to do a big tax package. This, they talked about, would save $4 billion. $4 billion is not nearly enough to do the tax package, but it's a start. So you combine all those things together, and what is a very important priority for higher ed becomes a very important thing for them to target. I mean, Sarah, do you think I'm missing anything on why they maybe went after it?
That seems about right to me. And I think I kind of wondered whether Republican lawmakers might, get in Trump's ear and say, like, again, even the most conservative lawmakers from Texas do not want the University of Texas at Austin to be mad. They know, as much as they have been trying their own state higher ed overhauls and passing new policies and new restrictions and new requirements, they know that the University of Texas at Austin is a gem. They know it's a huge employer. They know that it's driving huge amount of research, huge amount of economic impact. So I kind of thought maybe the Trump administration is going to realize, like, yeah, this was a little much. On the other hand, indirect costs on research, like this is a really hard thing. If you're higher ed and you're trying to make an argument, I know what the argument is and we can talk about that, but it's kind of hard to explain to the average person why that really matters. And like it
Yeah,
is also hard to explain, frankly, why Harvard needs 60 whatever percent back in indirect costs when they have a multi-billion dollar endowment. It's a tough one.
it requires a conversation, right? I mean, a place that has a higher cost can say it's more expensive to recruit people here because we have a higher cost of living, and it's more expensive to build here because we're in a urban area, whatever. There are all sorts of reasons why it might be more expensive, why you might need more. But you actually have to have a conversation, and that doesn't play well in the Twitter sphere that is where we have so many of our political arguments today.
So, Rick, before we get into what's next, we got to talk about DEI and the Ed department. Where do you
Yeah,
want to start?
this is so let's frame this as the third big policy initiative they pushed that we need to talk about. The first was the spending freeze. The second was the research funding overhead cuts. This is the Dear Colleague letter, which to folks like you, Sarah, who have covered Title IX, and to other folks who have worked in Title IX, the term Dear Colleague is, I don't know if notorious is the right word. It's certainly well known. Because there was a 2011 letter that changed the way that campuses must handle sexual assault claims. So we have a new Dear Colleague letter that may be just as notorious by the time we're all done, said and done. Like the last piece we talked about, like the overhead cap, the NIH grants. This one came out late at night. This one came out on a weekend, and this one landed with a big boom across the sector. Basically, as I understand it, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but I looked at this as much as I could and talked to as many people as I could about this one. The Trump administration took the Supreme Court case that said you cannot consider race in admissions decisions and is attempting to expand it to cover basically any consideration of race on campus. The letter is at once sweeping, threatening. It threatens federal funding if you don't comply, and vague because it does not actually define what it uses the term DEI and says DEI is not allowable, but it does not actually define the term DEI. Many folks have argued that that is intentional because by being vague, it incentivizes institutions to comply with rules that may or may not actually exist, to basically go further than the law requires. Here's where we have to talk more about the law. I'm so sorry, everybody, but Dear Colleague letters are not the law. They attempt to change action on the ground without redefining the law, while saying they don't redefine the law, but they are guidance on what the administration's interpretation of the law is. I think you have to look at this from the perspective of if you were negotiating with someone in a public negotiation. You're going to come out with something and say, you must do this, and try to play to the crowd and threaten as many downsides as you can. And that is basically what they're doing, saying, we want you to do something and we will investigate you if you don't. And if you lose the investigation, you could lose federal funding. Now, I have seen all sorts of levels of reaction to it. Some places or some folks say, oh, we have to immediately stop all DEI. Others say we were in compliance with the law yesterday, we're in compliance with the law today. I think we have to see who complies when. But I think one really important point that's easy to gloss over here is the feds just can't yank federal funding immediately. And that's the other part of this letter that I should have mentioned. I'm sorry. They said they basically suggested institutions have 14 days to comply. So by the end of the month. But you can't just yank federal funding at the end of the month, or at least no one has been able to previously. As I understand it, there's a long administrative process. There are several points where you can challenge it in court. So the question is, do institutions want to take the risk of complying or not complying, of having to go through an investigation process? So that is a very long, probably too winding summary of it. Sarah, what did I miss? What would you point out on that? How did I potentially confuse folks more than I helped them understand what's going on
I,
here.
I think we're all a little bit confused, and a big part of that is because Trump, in the executive orders that he signed on DEI, as well as in this letter, I mean, basically these documents say that DEI is illegal, but they don't really say what DEI is. The letter does offer some examples of what they think would constitute illegal consideration of race. They talk about graduation ceremonies, for example, that are sort of that, that the Black Student Union might have its own graduation ceremony in addition to sort of the main university graduation. One thing I do want to say here is, the anti-DEI movement is something that the Chronicle has been tracking for a while. Before Trump, we already saw a lot of dismantling of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts on campuses, both dismantling and changing names, altering, moving jobs, renaming jobs, getting rid of trainings, getting rid of diversity statements. Some of it was in response to state legislation. Some of it was preemptive. Some of it had nothing to do with the law. Some of it was, we feel like the sort of national winds are pointing in a certain direction, and we're just going to preemptively say, we're done with DEI.
It was a vibe shift.
And we're starting to see a lot more of that now that the Trump administration has sort of staked out its position on DEI. I mean, it feels like every few hours I see another, especially like big name university, University of Pennsylvania, Northeastern University. I see someone else that is taking down DEI web pages, potentially only temporarily to do a review, but you are seeing that preemptive compliance already. So even though there are a lot of questions about this Dear Colleague letter, about the scope, I think a lot of the higher ed associations are questioning whether this is overreach and are not sure that this would really hold up in court, but colleges are already complying. So I think that that's really important to point out. And this is trickling into the service academies as well. I mean, that's something that I know you've written about.
Yeah, the service academies, I think, are much clearer cases than colleges, although they may not be clear either. They are a unique set of institutions. They were actually exempted from the Supreme Court ruling that said you can't do race conscious admissions. They were allowed to continue race conscious admissions, although the new administration has said they will no longer be doing so. At least one of them, the Naval Academy, started upon order from the executive, weeding out various DEI operations. I think they did a keyword search for various keywords. I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but they just started looking for instances where I think bias was among them. Even something like bias was something that flagged a review. But the service academies are different because they are distinctly under the executive branch. What's going on with this Dear Colleague letter is the administration is trying to usher everyone, to herd everyone, including private institutions, to take action that the Supreme Court has not actually addressed. Now, that can be seen as teeing up court cases and a likely Supreme Court case to see how far the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard ruling actually extends. It can also just be seen as kind of saber rattling. And if institutions act on their own, pre-compliance, as you said, it doesn't, it has been effective. And so you're seeing it be effective. The question I think here is, what is DEI? And it's one of those things that we write about a lot. And even in a case like this, it's not clear. Okay, so a graduation ceremony is one thing. Does this extend into the classroom? The Higher Education Act very specifically says that it has restrictions to keep the feds from influencing curricular decisions. Yet here we are saber rattling and pointing to the Supreme Court and trying to influence curricular decisions, potentially with a bit of vagary. And so I don't know, sir, as we talk about DEI, this is one of those things I keep coming back to. This is a term that really exploded after 2020, and and colleges were all rushing and telling us how valuable it was that we address the racial reckoning and never backtrack on this. And now all of a sudden, this supposedly deeply held value, is it so deeply held? And so this was a suite of strategies that was rolled out to try to address a bunch of different things. Do we actually know what the suite of strategies is defined as?
As a reporter, who covered the aftermath of George Floyd on campus, this all feels super whiplashy, to be honest. On the note of equity, one of the other things we're seeing has to do with the education department canceling a bunch of contracts that have something ostensibly to do with equity. DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, is also canceling a bunch of other contracts having to do with education data. There is obviously the overarching issue of a proposal to dismantle the education department. There seems to be there's like a lot going on over there that is kind of hard to make sense of. One thing that I wonder about is like, as you're looking at what's happening at Ed, how much of this is new versus how much of this is what we've seen before? Because as we all know, Republicans have been trying to get rid of Ed forever. So how much of this is new versus how much of this is really striking to you?
As far as getting rid of the department, I think they are willing to either try to eliminate it or kind of just dismantle it or put some of its processes out to other agencies in a way that we haven't seen previously. But just actually closing the department requires an act of Congress. Congress is very, very closely divided. Congress is, by all prognostication, going to struggle to get a tax cut that Republicans agree should happen through. This closing the education department, while it does have a lot of support on the right, the last time there was a show vote on this, something like 40 congressional Republicans voted against closing the education department. So there are still some folks who are concerned about keeping it. And we have not seen a firm plan for what the administration wants to do, where it wants to put the things that the education department does. We've seen some suggestions that you could move loan administration to, I think it's the Department of the Treasury, move some of the OCR compliance to the Department of Justice. They may be doing that anyway with some of their moves as they talk about anti-Semitism investigations, for example. But the department does some things that are pretty important. It is statutorily required to do certain things, legally required to do certain things. That's why you need an act of Congress. But who is going to gather data on the education system? As a reporter, a lot of folks who do research, a lot of administrators use IPEDS, the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, to benchmark, to understand what's going on in the sector. I think IPEDS data is too slow to come, but it's still very valuable. Who does that? Does anyone do that? We could go on and on. This. The education department does important things. The FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. Who does that if not the education department? Now, a critic could say they didn't do such a bang-up job with the FAFSA last year when it was broken, but that still begs the question of, if you move it, if you do something different, put it in a different agency, will they do it better? And I think that's an answer that is forthcoming. One other thing on dismantling the education department that's important, I think. Linda McMahon had her confirmation hearing last week. And she was asked several questions about dismantling the department. One of the things she said that I think is really important is that the Trump administration does not want to spend less on education at the federal level. Now, given some of the cuts to other programs within the department that we've seen in the last week, you can quibble with that if you want. But her argument was, we do not want to spend less. We want to send it to the states through block grants, and the states can distribute the money more locally because they know more about what their students and economies need. And I think that model, or that difference in the model, is a fundamental argument that, I remember being in high school government class and we were talking about block grants as an argument. And so that's been around for a long time. There are block grants today that exist, and that doesn't mean that this wouldn't be a huge change in the way that a lot of these programs function and a lot of the latitude states have to do different things.
It also felt like Linda McMahon wanted to have it both ways. Like, we're not going to cut education funding. We're going to clamp down on colleges who are doing things we don't like, but we're also going to drastically shrink the department or get rid of it. It was hard to square those two things.
She had an exceptional hearing from the perspective of, did she field the questions correctly? I think the senators who questioned her were not always particularly aggressive, and those that tried to be aggressive were sometimes very, very deep in the law in a way that it was hard to really nail her down to anything because of that. But she fielded everything in the way that a candidate can do so, quote unquote, successfully to win confirmation. And I think her nomination advanced yesterday. I would expect her to be installed very soon.
So as we get into the last kind of quarter hour here, I wanted to talk about sort of higher ed's messaging in response to the Trump administration. One thing that I did want to point out that was really interesting to me is that the first lawsuit that we saw, the first example of higher ed really fighting back against Trump administration directives, it was not colleges themselves. It was not the higher ed lobbying groups. It was the American Association of University Professors and the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. They sued over Trump's DEI order. And the colleges got involved on the research side of things. I wonder what's your read on the extent to which the sector has fought back so far and kind of how they've been doing on the messaging front.
Well, I think the sector always struggles with messaging. And part of that is just that there are so many different types of institutions in the sector. Federal loan programs, federal student aid affects everything from medical colleges to community colleges. These grants affect research institutions, but they affect community colleges much, much less, if at all, in some cases. And it's hard to get everyone on the same page, other than kind of this big top line message that, well, we need to preserve or to have more funding. And I think the sector has, in some cases, struggled both to figure out a message that cuts through the various things it does, and probably also figure out what it wants and where it is willing to change. One thing in all of this is the higher ed system does wonderful, exceptional things. It's very important for research. Graduation rates could be better. Student transfer is a problem. I mean, there are real things that frustrate people with the way it works. And I think it is hard because the sector's been very effective at preserving funding, but it has not been as effective at reforming itself. And that set up this situation where if you don't change on your own, sometimes you are forced to change in ways that maybe are not healthy for everyone or anyone, or you think aren't healthy for everyone and anyone. So I think there's a lot of soul searching going on at the top. Having said that, I am surprised at the lack of clarity coming from the presidential level. I'm also surprised at the clearer messaging I'm seeing shaping up at some of the associations. So it doesn't go in one way. I don't know. What do you think? I know you're really watching what presidents are saying right now.
I think, one thing that we've been following for the last couple of years, honestly, is sort of the trend on institutional neutrality and where colleges are essentially promising not to make any statements on any political matter because they don't want to alienate various stakeholders, campus community members who disagree. And as much as that is mostly an issue affecting the Harvards of the world, like, I don't want to put them on a pedestal, but colleges are paying attention to what they are doing.
Not just
So now we've got,
colleges, employees, staff, students,
right.
right? This leadership starts at the top. It really trickles down.
And now we've got political matters that directly harm colleges, like the funding, the NIH funding cut would be really existential. And so you're like, okay, so what are they going to do in that situation? And to be fair, a lot of colleges did actually speak up about research. I think I've seen a lot of criticism that college leaders have not had the same stance on preserving diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. It's been noticeably different. The other thing I was going to say is that, there's a larger context here where colleges have taken a reputational hit, like, for years now. There's obviously the age-old criticism that institutions are pushing progressive orthodoxy in the classroom and in campus programming. We've seen that in many Republican states especially. More broadly, there's the like, is college worth it line that has just gotten louder and louder over the last few years. And it puts colleges kind of on their heels. It feels like they're in a really weak position. And I was just talking with another university president who came by our office yesterday, and we were talking about like, okay, so how do you tell the story and get the message to cut through? We've heard if you ask college leaders what the message is, they will always tell you, we'll talk about our economic impact. We'll talk about the fact that we're a major employer. We'll talk about the critical research we're doing in cancer treatment. We'll talk about how we uplift people and, earn them $1 million extra in their lifetime and propel them into the next social class. I mean, we hear that argument, but something is not cutting through. And that's what I'm going to be so interested to see if higher ed can ever figure out how to tell a sort of unified story that actually cuts through in a way that people understand.
Yeah, it's struggled to it's struggled to communicate values or to usher the public behind the values that underlie a liberal, small L liberal education, right? And that, I think that's the bigger issue, right? If you're talking about economic mobility, you're not talking about kind of the way that your curriculum and the way that your institutions are structured and why they're structured that way. But that gets really complicated, and complexity is bad messaging today. So I think that's absolutely right. But one thing you mentioned is the institutional neutrality pledges that a lot of campuses have, or rules that a lot of campuses have. Most of the ones I remember have exceptions for public policy debates that directly affect the campus. And so the way I read that is, if a president is not speaking in the face of some of these things, that sends as much of a message as speaking would. If the president is saying we're forming a working group, that sends as much of a message as saying we're just going to comply or speaking out would on either end. There is a recent development this week that I think is really interesting on this point, though. As much as I just interrupted you to say that leadership starts at the top and what presidents say matters, there were some instances of labor-led protests, either on campus or by faculty members. In one case, students were protesting an institution that they felt was not or was going to over-comply with the DEI Dear Colleague letter. I think that's really interesting. I think that's really important. As we referenced earlier, there was kind of this question of whether protest would be springing up or even allowable under policies that changed after the pro-Palestinian protests and the ensuing crackdowns. And I think the open question right now is whether students, whether employees, whether the folks who are not at the leadership level start to make noise, right? If there is going to be pushback, an equal and opposite reaction to the action that the Trump administration has taken, some of it will be in the courts, some of it will be at the leadership level, and some of it will be at the student or ground level. Otherwise, the Trump administration will probably get what they want.
Well,
And so I'm really interested to see if this protest movement catches on or just kind of peters out.
and to that point, I think we've been talking at a pretty high level for a lot of our conversation today. And I do just want to acknowledge that people, faculty, staff, students are experiencing like real impacts of this. I mean, for example, the Chronicle reported out a scoop about 10 days ago that the NIH was essentially just tossing out grant applications from minority researchers because they had a diversity notation on them. After we reported the story, the NIH reversed course, at least for that particular program. But these are these are real human impacts, and we actually are just about to publish a story, sort of chronicling some of the people who are experiencing these things on the ground. And I just wanted to acknowledge that, and the fact that, frankly, higher ed was already exhausted before Trump's second term began. I mean, we just did a big survey of faculty and staff that found just they're so burned out, right? And everyone in this room knows that. And even though that project didn't talk about the administration, we know those jobs are under the gun. We know college leaders are turning over faster than ever. It's higher ed was already feeling so many pressure points, and now it's just been turned up to 11.
Right. There's something really interesting going on here where enrollment actually was stronger than folks expected this year, and yet budgets
Even
were
though we
still
didn't
under
know that
significant
at
pressure.
first, even though we didn't know that at first.
Right. There was a big data issue for those of you who have not been following the National Clearinghouse Data Center revisions. But yeah, so enrollment was stronger, but budgets didn't weren't really stronger. And you have an upcoming expected decline in the students who number of high school students graduating who traditionally would have been most likely to enroll in college. So the sector's facing some long-term pressures that are not political, that are just birth rate related. And now you keep the political pressure on, and there certainly are reasons to be concerned. I mean, I think that plays into this, what we opened up talking about, this muzzle velocity strategy, this move fast, overwhelm, flood the zone strategy. And I don't know, my hope, when I write the daily briefing every day is I can give you everything you need to know to start your day. You can read the email, you can close it, and you can turn the notifications off on your phone. You can go about your job because that's all you can probably control anyway. That's the value I'm trying to bring to folks. And when I feel overwhelmed when I'm writing briefing, I try to tell myself something I read in a sports column a long time ago. When the clock's ticking down, don't panic. There will be plenty of time for that later. Control what you can control and try to make sense of it. And so, I hope that when we do things like this, when we go through a high level discussion about what's happened, but also the likely strategies behind it, the potential ramifications, what we're seeing, I hope we're providing good context for folks. And I hope the briefing can provide both that good context, but also just the right amount of additional detail. And that's a really hard thing for us all to do. It's a tightrope that we're all walking, right?
I've got one more question for you. As we're looking ahead to the weeks and months to come, what's the big question that you'll be asking as a reporter? And then also kind of in addition to that, what issues are you following? Like what's kind of top of mind for you? One thing I'm wondering about is the endowment tax. There's a lot of fear around the potential of congressional Republicans to increase the endowment tax on certain colleges. So what's a big question you're asking and what else are you following?
The endowment tax is a really good one. We'll see what happens there. There were proposals to greatly ramp it up. But I'm also interested in seeing what happens at open access institutions, community colleges, regional publics that are not well endowed or endowed at all, that do not have competitive admissions that admit everyone who applies or near everyone who applies. They are, in some cases, as affected or more affected by funding freezes because they are very reliant on students who require federal funding, and they generally run very, very tight budgets. The Ivy League institutions, for all of the large scale and the amount of money they spend and how much they may have to cut, they do have bigger financial heft to skate through uncertainty. Whether and how much this affects institutions that do not have that cushion and that serve the majority of students in the sector, I think is really important. What employees are seeing on the ground there, I think, is really important. Whether they comply with these directives against DEI or anything else the administration puts out because they feel they don't have a choice, because they probably have less ability to skate out a problem or ability to fight in court is important. And then who kind of rises to litigate either in the actual legal courts or in the court of public opinion, and how those cases go, even as they will be slow, are other really important key questions. I could go on. Will they actually disband the department? What's the plan there? But I really think kind of that we have seen the blitz. Once we get through the blitz, maybe the blitz never ends. But how does it translate on the ground is the really important question that we never want to forget and that we'll try to keep watching.
Well, Rick, this has been great. We got through as much as we could. And again, we're hoping to do this in the future. So thank you so much, Rick, for sharing your expertise with us. And thanks to everybody in the audience for joining us. We really encourage you to keep up with us. Tell us what you want to hear. Tell us what you're seeing and experiencing on the ground. Please do consider subscribing to the Daily Briefing for a quick rundown daily dose of what is happening in the Trump administration. And we'll hope to see you again soon. Thanks
Thank
so
you,
much,
everyone.
everyone. Cheers. Bye.